soon. So, there's ways our paths crossed.
Good evening.
We don't have anybody yet.
We're not on though.
We're live, but nobody's viewing yet.
That might be a good thing.
It might take people a couple minutes to
Yeah.
get the notification.
They get a notification that we're on.
We have one view, too.
All right. Good evening. Welcome to Facebook Live from the Conrad Center right here in downtown Deland, Florida. Welcome to our September meeting of the West Volusia Historical Society. This is our general meeting. Thank you all for being with us. Thank you for being with us live in the audience, and I believe that we're going to be able to have this taped also, so those who are not able to join us right in the moment will be able to see later on. My name is Deborah McShane, and I am the current president of the West Volusia Historical Society. I'm so happy to be here tonight. We have a very special guest who will be coming in the door just a little bit en retard because the traffic from Lake Helen was a little bit much this evening, but he is on the road, and we have a few introductory remarks before he makes his presentation tonight. So here we are. We thought we would be actually live. We do have a small live audience here, but we did decide because of the Delta variant surging in Central Florida that it was a little bit safer to go back to Zoom for our September meeting, and we'll see how it goes for October. We have a number of activities going on. Tomorrow night at 6 o'clock, our Makers Guild is going to be gathering. Karen Tweedy is the head of this group. They're working on a project it's called Christmas in Bloom, and they are making all sorts of fanciful and some historically oriented goods that they'll have for sale at our big fundraiser that will be happening in late November out at Select Growers. We also have coming up this fall History Seekers, which are different workshops that are going on for young people. Our walking tours are starting up again after a summer hiatus. We have Karen Long, Stan O'Neill, and a number of the other docents who will be helping out. The tours will be in the morning, Wednesdays and Saturdays. It does take an advance reservation. So we'd like you to call the office, call the Conrad Center to make your reservation. The tours of Deland House itself have currently been suspended as we're working on a project of reimagining Deland House, working with the city on some certain structural restoration pieces and a little bit of a reimagining of the house so that we'll be bright and cheery for our 50th anniversary, which is coming up next year. Well, I have a special guest tonight. I'd like to do an introduction for him. Our guest is Mr. Mark Shuttleworth of Florida Victorian Architectural Salvage. Mark and his well-known artist wife, Anna Tomczak, have been residents of Lake Helen for 42 years. He was the mayor of Lake Helen for 8 years during his 15-year tenure on the Lake Helen City Commission. He's a former board member for the Board of Trustees for the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation and a former member of the Volusia County Historic Preservation Board. Mark's currently serving in his 5th year on the Lake Helen Historic Preservation Board. Some of his notable preservation projects through Florida Victorian include restoration of the 1916 Deland train station, restoration work at the Pioneer Settlement for the Arts in Barberville, Hopkins Hall, and City Hall in Lake Helen, the Volusia County Courthouse in Deland, the DeBerry Hall Horse Carriage House restoration, and many other projects throughout Florida. He's helped supply innumerable amounts of architectural details and artifacts for commercial projects, homes, and restaurants and bars throughout the Southeast. Mr. Shuttleworth is proud to be a current member of the West Volusia Historic Society. Mark, I'd like to welcome you and thank you so much for being our speaker for our September meeting. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Just a second here to arrange some photographs. I was talking with my family and I told them I was doing this presentation, and being the good brother, one of my brothers, Eric's from, of course he's a New Yorker from Manhattan, he said, well, whatever you do, don't be boring. So with that in mind, I brought some pictures and I just want to kind of go through kind of a narrative, if you will, of what I've been through as a architectural salvage dealer and also a historic preservation person. And with that, I think we'll answer some questions about historic districts and economic development. And certainly I welcome any questions from anybody in the audience or anybody that's on Facebook that cares to send it in, and I'll try to respond, you know. Last week, I was thinking about what I was going to say here for several weeks and agonizing about it. And then I just had a really interesting experience. I went to Crescent City. I got a call from the city manager up there, Charles Rudd. And he's a new administrator there. I think he's only been there maybe half a year or so, maybe a year. And they have a Masonic temple that's there. And he said the city owns it and they're going to tear it down because it's falling apart. And I went up there and I was driving on the main street. I misunderstood his directions on where it was. So I had to call him, and then we ended up going around the back side of the main street there. And it turns out this is kind of in a neighborhood where there's chairs and tables and stuff across the street in a vacant lot, and there's a big, huge camphor tree about 6 or 7 feet in diameter. And he said, well, this is kind of a strange neighborhood. I met him there. What impressed me so much, this house is an African-American former Masonic lodge, but it looked like kind of like a house in Key West. It had a 2-story porch with chamfered columns, a nice railing. It was kind of that worn out white paint look kind of to it. And it was certainly in bad repair. They had had a fire in the attic. Part of the porch was falling in. There was no restoring this building at all. There was just no way to do it. So I started to look through. And I went up, downstairs they had a kitchen area and that sort of thing, but upstairs there was a series of benches. They had 5 long wood, primitive type, homemade benches, but they had these gorgeous, cute little stations, I'm sure for their Masonic ritual. And despite all the junk and the smells and everything else in this beat up building, I just went back to seeing these African-American men from whatever, 30, 40, 50 years ago, working guys, construction people, obviously some agricultural workers. It was Crescent City. And all of a sudden I was kind of in the middle of that meeting with them, even though I'm not at all familiar with Masonic ritual. Sometimes that's what historic preservation means for me. It's intensely personal. I love the materials I deal with. And I was trying to think, I was coming back and I was so moved by that, just that experience. I do plan on trying to talk, and they were talking about cutting down the camphor tree. And I said, I'm going to work with him to say don't do it. I ended up making a bid for Salvage, and I'm hoping they'll accept it. I think they're going to meet next week on it. The point is, I'm excited about that building. Most people would look at that and say, what a bunch of junk.
Yeah.
But there's some beautiful ingredients in there, including some of those furnishings that can be reused. And I go back to I think a lot of us are product of our childhood. It isn't it's certainly what we're about is partly heredity, but certainly a lot of it's environment. I was raised on an 87-acre farm in southern Ontario. At one point we had dairy cattle, we had beef cattle. My father raised bees. My mother was an antique dealer and a designer. My father was in construction. But what I remember is this 87-acre farm, we had these huge old wooden barns that were 100 years old at the time. And as a kid, I would help with the haying and the mowing on the trailers. But I loved to be in the barns, to look at this big, huge place and make burrows as a kid. You know, my parents had 4 boys and 2 girls, so there's always companions to fight with and carry on and run around with the cattle and everything else there. But that space there in the springtime, to be in those big fields around those big buildings, just it just always affected me. And for some reason, it came back around later in my life, you know. So I'll show you some pictures. My wife and I were married in 1978, and just by sheer luck, we managed about 4 or 5 months later to find an old 1893 house, 2-story house. It was an older woman that had lived in there for 40 years or so. Her deceased husband had been in there, I think, for 60 years. It was an old family that had owned it. One family had it since about 1905, 1910. So when my wife and I moved in, we were maybe the 5th owner of that house. And it was just a great experience to be in a 2-story house with porches all the way around, and you could sit out on the porch. We spent endless amount of time even now on the porches. It was a good experience to go through. It was interesting. 6 months after we moved in, the honeycomb septic tank fell in. A couple months later, the central heat and air conditioning went out. You know, problems you have when you're young married and you don't have any money. Here we are 43 years later, and I'm still working on the house. I think I've got a picture here, yeah. So now this is after we did a paint job last year. We have a really excellent painter, Jim Hansen, here in town. That's a wonderful guy, and he did a superb job. This was the first time I'd had the house painted in about 30 years, and it really needed it. But it's a great house, and when we moved in, I started to look for parts because we wanted to have a clawfoot bathtub. I didn't know where to look. I started to look at junkyards and places like that, and I found this gorgeous oval fluted base and pedestal sink on top of a scrap pile with a big huge sledgehammer beside it, and a big huge chunk had been busted out of it. And they were scrapping it out for the metal value of this gorgeous sink. And I said, somebody's got to be saving this stuff. And around here they weren't. Just simply there was nobody doing serious salvage work on a day-to-day basis. So in 1981, I left a perfectly good job teaching at Daytona State College. Really enjoyed teaching, didn't like the bureaucracy too much, but I dove into salvage, and it was an incredible experience. At that point, I was 32 years old. I was just dumb, but, you know, I started a business. Soon after that, my wife started graduate school, so our money was a little tight. But by sheer luck, they had started to salvage, to demolish block after block after blocks of buildings for the Ocean Center over in Daytona Beach. I was able to go in and talk to the demo guys and purchase a house for $50, $100, something like that, and take out whatever I wanted, but you had to really move fast. it was a great period for me. You know, I had a couple carpenter friends from Orlando that also came over. We were like a party of thieves. You know, we would all argue about who was getting what and who was supposed to be in what house and what was going on. But it was a great experience. Just to show you some other things here, I will show you. This is a studio I built for my artist wife, Anna Tomczak. It's 900 square feet plus the outdoor porches and carports with it. We built that about 12 years ago. A friend of mine named Bill Sherrick built it for us. We did most of the design. I don't know how, if you can see close, there's a round window in there that's from a church in New Hampshire that's about 6.5 feet in diameter. In fact, when Bill put in the window, he stood up there in his shorts like Da Vinci's Universal Man. And anyway, it was a great studio experience to have that. So we just designed it to kind of complement the house. Use 5V tin on it, that sort of thing. Moving along, my involvement in Lake Helen got me involved in this building right here. This is the 1912 bank building in Lake Helen. It's neoclassic house. You can see a neoclassic commercial building. You can see the kind of temple-like design at the front. There are 4 big, huge Doric columns, 10 feet tall, that really set off the building. It's yellow sand brick, buff sand brick, which is kind of unusual. Most sand brick from the Bond Lumber Company was the white gray brick. Sand brick is interesting. It's been an albatross for me, frankly. It's hard to hold it together. It's not red kiln-fired brick, it's sand brick. So structurally you have issues with it sometimes. And I have those issues in several buildings that I'm involved in. This building is part of the downtown historic district in Lake Helen. Lake Helen has had some consultants come in, and they've developed a downtown development plan utilizing historic preservation as one of the key components of what they do in the downtown area. There's also the City Hall that I worked on years ago, back in 2003, 2004, that did belong to the school board. It was the Minerva Bon Long Elementary School that we converted into City Hall. And that's worked out really well as a public building. If you get a chance to go upstairs in there, we bought chairs out of Dayton, Ohio, out of a Masonic temple to put inside the auditorium, because all the auditorium chairs that were in there originally were school kids, and they were all taken out by the school board. So we ended up buying 465 chairs from Ohio. We only needed 110, but we needed to order to get ends and all that kind of stuff. When we ordered the chairs, I ordered the extras to make sure we had enough. As it was, we lucked out. There was an African American Masonic temple group in Jacksonville. They came along and bought enough that we ended up absolutely not costing the taxpayer any money. It was touch and go, because we went through a hurricane. They were inside a container. They got all moisture all over. We had to get them reupholstered, but everything worked out. If you get a chance to see it, it's upstairs in the City Hall. And there are artists from all over Florida that have contributed paintings, drawings, brass sculpture, glass sculpture that's on each end of the rows. So it's really an unusual project. The importance to me of this building is my partner and I, Mike Woods from Lake Helen. He and I have owned it now for about 6 years. We're planning on restoring the interior, adding to the exterior. We're going to put a long outdoor roof area, if you will, and we're going to have it as an entertainment facility and cafe, with a restaurant. In Lake Helen, the codes allow for a food truck and even a permanent food truck, so we'll probably build a wall in keeping architecturally, so it'll get approved by the historic board of the city. So we hope to be reusing the building. It's been sitting there now for 7 or 8 years. It was empty for a couple of years before I bought it. But I'm feeling like if we do that, that's going to be the key to developing a little bit of business in downtown Lake Helen. Now, they don't need blocks and blocks and blocks of things going on, but they sure could use a hardware store, a gift store, some other restaurants, things that local people could go to. So as Lake Helen and the surrounding population increases, even though, like everybody, we complain about the traffic and the development, in some ways for a town like Lake Helen, hopefully that will draw more people to the downtown. In a little bit, I'll go on to talking about Deland and their downtown area, because that's a whole different, that was Lake Helen 35, 40 years ago, in a sense of what happened there downtown. In fact, actually, I could go to that right now. This is the home of Florida Victorian architectural salvage right now. I bought this in 1988 on a wing and a prayer. I was in Sanford in an old citrus packing warehouse, but it was belonged by the railroad. They wanted a ridiculous price for it, and it was just a beat up old building that was a fire trap. I wanted to move it to Lake Mary or Longwood, but a realtor friend of mine told me about this building that was available. The reason I moved to Deland was because of the Main Street program in Deland. They had only started a few years before. They had a National Trust grant. I believe it's the first Main Street in the entire state of Florida. And the beauty of Main Street is what they do. They usually have the local government for a couple of years pay the salary of a Main Street manager. And then as that Main Street program developed with more merchants signing on and banks and insurance company and local people that care about the community sign on and become members, it becomes self-sustaining. And that's what's happened in Deland. The Main Street program is what has made downtown Deland prosper. A lot of towns around Florida are suffering with their downtown. What Main Street program did, and what all the merchants and a very progressive town council and historic preservation board, we all worked together to make it happen. One of the keys, I think, to a good downtown program that's based on historic preservation is authenticity. You don't need corporate stuff. You don't need phony restaurants with phony names. Just be what you are. One of the little things that makes downtown Deland really wonderful is some work that Jackie Kirsch and some other people on the museum board did. Where are we here? 10, 15 years ago with the brass plaques. For instance, in front of this building here that I used to own, I'll explain that a little bit. There's a plaque that says 1925 and it has all the history of the building. There's another plaque on the courtyard for Cafe Da Vinci right next door that says 1893, because there's a place called Hodgkin's Blacksmithing was in there. And to this day, when they dig it in the courtyard to put electric lines or water lines in, they still find buckets and buckets of horseshoes and old Model A and Model T parts, that kind of thing, you know. But I bought this building in '88, again on a wing and a prayer. Sometimes that happens in preservation. You luck out. The previous tenant had been there with auto parts for years and years and years, but he tried to hold on. And selling car parts, all the wholesalers came in, and it was just tougher and tougher. I took over an SBA loan and was lucky a friend of mine offered a second mortgage, and we were able to restore the building. One other thing that happens with the Main Street program is they offer some incentives that really help out. At that time, there was a $2,000 facade improvement grant you could get. Well, I was using every nickel I had, and my second mortgagee was willing to give me to help out. That $2,000 made a big difference. We had to go before the historic board, the the Main Street board, to show them the colors we were going to use. But hey, if they'll pay $2,000, I was glad to cooperate. Those kind of incentives really helped me to come to Deland. The idea that somebody as a merchant and you're a young entrepreneur, that they're going to kind of help you out and look out for you and work with the city council and the city staff to help the downtown really makes a huge difference. As most of you know, Deland has prospered really well, particularly on this street where this is. This is at 112 West Georgia Avenue. I was one of the first people on the street. I bought this building in '88, and I bought it because I needed 8,000 square feet for all my stuff. And I since then had it filled to the gills with stuff. And I try to sell it as often as I can. But the point is, I stayed there long enough, more and more people started to come. All of a sudden, people across the street came. Trilogy Coffee Company moved down the street. Long before that, Barb Shepherd and her Conrad Real Estate Group came in, bought the 5 buildings in front, started to restore those, and now the whole place is thriving on Friday nights. It's like a pedestrian festival mecca. You can get all kinds of food items, all kinds of artists creating artisan works. It's very social, everybody has a good time. It's the perfect attraction for the downtown, and it's been, it's hard to say anything negative because there's not much negative you can say about it, you know, and it's drawn other people down the street now. So Trilogy Coffee Company is in there. There's a young architect and his wife, and she's doing design work in there and there. There's the other several breweries now on the street that are doing really well. And that's kind of activity starting to spread out into other streets further on down, which I'll talk about in a minute here. In fact, I'll move on with this. I had the opportunity to buy this building, which the city of Deland had taken for taxes and code enforcement problems for years, and there were all kinds of situations in 08, 09 with strange mortgages and all kinds of stuff that the tenant, the city had a hard time doing all the record keep to find out who actually owned it and what the legal obligations were, et cetera. But they put it up and they had a request for a proposal, and I thought, well, somebody will submit for an art gallery, somebody will submit for maybe a daycare center. The building had problems. The foundations were caving in, and it had an asbestos shingle roof, which is, toxic and not very environmentally safe. Other leaks and problems. There were termites in the building. It had a series of problems. I was the only one that put out a request for a proposal, and we I was the only one to do that, and the city, we went back and forth and negotiated. So I bought this building. It was only $25,000. Bear in mind, it had a lot of problems. I sunk all the air conditioning some of it had been stolen. Copper pipe had been stolen out of there. There was a homeless person living underneath part of it. There were some issues there for sure. But it's adjoining property to mine. I did put $160,000 into restoring the building, but it's working. For a few years, it was kind of, can I afford this? Was this a mistake? Now I have 5 commercial tenants downstairs with various kinds of retail items and food items downstairs, and several tenants upstairs. So it's turned out that the building's doing quite well, thank you. It's giving me enough return to pay the mortgage, pay the taxes, etc. And the other thing to say, this is Howery Avenue. There's other possibilities that are going to happen on Howery Avenue. There's some other old houses there down the street to the, just slightly to the west of us is that huge property that's all for sale there. There was some issue that maybe one of the developers that's proposing to do a big development downtown might buy it. So we'll see what happens all on Howery. And of course they've done the police station, and now that the police evidence room is down there, that whole area could lead to more pedestrian economic development, more areas possibly for retail development because of all the activity at Georgia Avenue and Indiana Avenue and downtown. This is a building on Eastboris that I bought. It was just a very simple block building. I bought it because I needed more space for all my stuff. It's about 6,000 square feet downstairs. There were 3 simple 1960s cement block buildings. But when you looked at it, it had a concrete courtyard in the middle of where all 3 buildings. And a friend of mine who's an artist out of St. Augustine, Jan Master, she said, "Mark, it's sort of like a hacienda." And we monitored it, and I ended up buying it from a private seller. And then we put in a metal clay tile roof on it. It looks like clay tile, but it's metal roof with stone encrusted. So if you're further than about 20 feet away, it looks like an authentic Spanish roof. And I'm slowly fixing it up. It doesn't have any plumbing. Well, it's got very little plumbing. We've got a power pole out in front, so it needs a lot of work. Eventually, we're hoping to develop this into artist studio space when I don't need it anymore for my salvage business. Artist studio space with a gallery space, that kind of thing. Long range, that could be a Voorhees Avenue corridor, very simple to George Avenue. Eventually, it might be 5 or 10 years from now, but as the land expands and as commercial expands, you know, there's possibilities there. There should have been a couple of, did Danny bring other? No, he didn't bring, well, this is a building I bought recently on West Voorhees Avenue. That was an 1893 house. No, that's not it, yeah. It's an 1893 house that I bought. It's right across from the Wright building that I'm involved with. This one, the Children's Home Society was in it. It had been moved from where the police evidence building is now. It was moved here in 1988. And they had some social work activity in there and some other things going on. Finally, the Children's Home Society had it, but they did a very tasteful job. It's got a gorgeous staircase going upstairs. It has curly pine wood trim on it. And the Children's Home Society wanted it for a visitation area, supervised visitation for parents having trouble raising their kids. And they just did a really good job. I'm buying it now. The interior, there's very little we have to do. I'm going to replace some of the doors. The exterior is going to be painted and fixed up. And this will become part of the Voorhees Avenue streetscape, which the city of Deland is saying they're going to spend $500,000 to $600,000 on that in that big 2-block area from Woodland over to Clara. My point in bringing that up is that investment is Community Redevelopment Agency or Tax Increment District. It's part of the downtown. It's the southernmost part of the commercial historic area downtown. There's church parking lots there. There's other private property for sale, and there's one whole block that's got historic homes in it from Florida over to Woodland, and you don't really see them because the traffic drives fairly fast and everybody's interested in getting out to 1792. But there's a Spanish Revival house there. There's several framed vernaculars. There's a colonial revival house. There's this cute little historic district waiting right there. Plus what we're doing up at the one block over there. There's this building here, and then there's the Wright building, which is owned by Greater Union Life Center. We've been working on that bill. I'm the project manager for that. I volunteered, and it's been a challenge, let's say, to restore the building. I think some contractors had suggested bulldozing it when I got involved, and I guess I like a challenge. The roof had caved in. There was termites everywhere. It was packed with building materials. Over the last 3 years, we cleaned it out. Greater Union Life Center and Greater Union Baptist Church, which is across the street. It's 135 years old, that church, catty corner across the street. They put up a lot of money, and we managed to shore it back up, and we're now working on the windows and doors under a grant from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And we should finish those exterior windows and doors this fall. And then we're going to move on to brickwork and painting the building. My point in that is that whole area right there is another area that, first of all, could be improved with pedestrian walkways, bike paths. It certainly needs more trees planting. It needs more benches, that kind of thing. And it's an excellent situation. It's right in the transition between the African American residential district and the downtown development business district. We're hoping we can have a job in an entrepreneur's incubator in there that will help stimulate business in the African American community. There's also a fairly strong Latino population and Caribbean population right in that greater Spring Hill area. So we hope this will be a real game changer, not just economically, but culturally for the whole city. So we'll see how that works. And one last thing, I can't help but do a little promotion for the Deland House Museum and the West Volusia Historic Society. This is just a little picture I took in the rain this afternoon, so it's a little gray. My point is I'm looking forward, as several other people are, to helping restore that building. You know, the people that did it back in the 1980s, at the late 80s, did an excellent job of saving the building and putting in exhibits, and now we're going to kind of fine tune it. Some of the lighting fixtures could be changed. Some of the wallpapers after 30 years certainly need refreshing. Some of the floors, I'm going to donate some flooring, and some other people are going to help out with donations and material. The city of Deland owns this and has owned it for 30 some odd years, but it's administered by the West Volusia Historic Society to do all the programming inside. So it's really an exciting project. I would invite anybody to stay in touch with the Historic Society, take out a membership, come here to the Conrad Center if you need to do research. If you own a historic house and are curious about the history of it, come on down, talk to the staff here, they'll try to help you out. So I think I'm available for any questions if anyone has any. I saw you looking at your watch, so I thought I'd check.
One correction that came through so far on our feed here, it was Sally Landis Bohan who was in charge of the bronze plaques through downtown Deland, not Jackie Kirsch.
Oh, okay.
She did the restoration workshops. But if anybody viewing online does have a question for Mark, I can see your comments, so if you post those as a comment in this thread, we can ask those to Mark.
My apologies to Sully Bohan. She's certainly been a great volunteer for the museum and all kinds of projects and historic preservation stuff for years and years and years. I guess maybe it was Jackie that actually, maybe Jackie helped out. Maybe that was it, but I somehow remember her being involved in it also.
So a question from one of our viewers, any plans to include the homes in DeLeon Springs?
Well, DeLeon Springs is a separate community, and it's not an incorporated community. So in a sense, there is somewhat a disadvantage in the sense they're not a municipal government. DeLeon Springs is I think the county has it's sort of called a community of special interest, very similar to Cassadaga, has no particular, the county government is their government. And so with communities like that, they really have to look to the county for obviously public works and projects, but also kind of political guidance and help. Volusia County has certainly been sympathetic to Cassadaga staying how Cassadaga people want it. It's the 4139 highway that goes through Lake Helen and through Cassadaga. They've helped to maintain that as a very small, simple country road. They haven't expanded it. So they're I think the county's done an excellent job of preserving small communities and protecting them from overdevelopment. You know, Deltona is very close to Cassadaga, and Deltona kind of in the past has had a whole different attitude than Cassadaga and Lake Helen, which are very much slow growth communities. People that live there like it just how it is right now, thank you. And so they don't want to make the compromises to have further development, really.
Any suggestions how to move forward to preserve the historical homes in DeLeon Springs?
Well, certainly some local people that are interested in doing that. As far as I know, there is a DeLeon, and I'm sorry I'm not up to speed, there is a DeLeon Springs Community Association, I believe, that is all local citizens there, and I know they meet fairly regularly to do projects, so someone could maybe get in touch with them. Also, certainly, if you have a specific concern, say about historic preservation, for instance, or older homes, you could talk to the county administrator that handles a guy named Robert. I'm sorry, I'm trying to think of his last name. I'm embarrassed, I can't remember it. He's in charge of historic preservation in the county and working with that historic board. So they would be one of the people administering some issues there in DeLeon Springs. Also similar to Enterprise, and again, Enterprise is in the county, but it's a community of special interest. Enterprise, I thought, was going to be swallowed by Deltona, and they asserted themselves, and now they have a regular yearly festival. They have their own museum, and I think that's what a citizen would want to do in those smaller areas. It's certainly find out who's there with you that has the same attitudes that you have, and try to work together and form an alliance to have periodic events that are authentic and real, because that's what you're preserving, is your own real community. That's why historic preservation is so important, because you preserve the history, the legacy, that which is important to people that were there, and you keep that remembrance going. And it can really lead to some powerful things and a quality of life that's more pedestrian and slow growth and family oriented, and sitting on the porch and getting to know your neighbors instead of being in a tract house community where everybody has their air conditioners running all the time and nobody knows who lives next door, you know.
So Mark, are you involved at all in the working toward, like, say, I guess it was the Sandhill, I don't know what they're calling it, but it's kind of up for development right now. I know in front of the county council or the city council that the development of looking at that, and a number of people are working toward, let's try to develop it as a huge park and a multi-use area, that we are going through this sort of growth spurt here in Deland, and that's an awfully big piece of property to go toward too many houses, and the concept of a little slower growth, and there are smaller pockets where and growth can be really good, of course, but not maybe. Things seem like they're really changing right now in this sort of pandemic, post-pandemic, people trying to get away from other places and trying to preserve the integrity our little small town.
Yeah, I stay up in the newspapers. There are a lot of good people that are concerned about what might happen there, and the alternative ideas of a big, huge park certainly resonates with me. I think open space, when all these tract developments come in, we're going to be glad we tried to save some open space. And those are kind of issues are there. I frankly am so busy with both the properties I own, trying to nudge them along as I can afford it, but also that working on the right building, my crew is actively working on that every single week. And again, some issues in Lake Helen with historic preservation, and we're trying to see about building a trail from Lake Helen through Deep Creek to New Smyrna Beach. And it looks promising. Maybe next spring that Lake Helen might apply for an ECHO grant and maybe a Volusia Forever grant to save some open space right next to what the trail is proposed to be. So I'm just kind of, I'm involved pretty heavily in what I'm doing.
You're helping with Deland House.
What I find when you get involved with issues, you really need to do your homework and go to all the meetings and become a well-informed advocate. I know when I was on the city commission, sometimes we would have a citizens group come to us, and we were always able to respond much better if we had a well-educated group that knew what they wanted and what the real issues were, not just rumors or ideas or maybe there's an eagle that lives there, maybe, that kind of thing, but real evidence-based stuff really helped to convince me as an elected official when we had those kind of issues. So, but I certainly sympathize with the idea of saving open space. Unfortunately, it's not cheap these days to do that. But an investment now is a whole lot better than an investment in 5 or 10 or 20 years, because it won't be available and we'll wish it did. Part of the beauty of why people go to Europe every year is because every city has these huge parks that I think really help to keep the citizens sane. You can go out with a baby stroller, you can walk for a mile down a park area, you can have fountains, you can have musical festivals, you can have all of those, and I think that's really important to preserve some big open spaces for those kind of activities and gardens and festivals and things. So,
So 2 things that have come through online. One is from Sally Bohan. Mark, just as a point of interest, those 3 cottages across from Greater Union Baptist on Clara, ? The center one was owned for many years by Julia West, whose sister was B. Coleman, wife of Dr. Senator Coleman, one of Deland's early black physicians. And a question that came through were, what are your future plans for the Wright building?
Well, she's 2 different issues there, but as far as those cottages go, my understanding is they are privately owned. I wish somebody a group had more money to buy those at some point and try to save them. We've had discussions. Some people in town have suggested that those kind of cottages were originally for agricultural workers and also for railroad workers. And because there's a certain look that they have, like they were production made to house workers for the company. And it would be interesting to try to preserve that kind of history. But the Wright building is a project that's going to take another year or 2 at least. We're applying for a state grant in October that the state legislature recently appropriated $24 million specifically for African American preservation and cultural projects. And a building like the Wright, we just got it on the National Register of Historic Places in February. And the interesting thing, the state board that passed it up to the Washington board gave a statewide significance, meaning J.W. Wright, as the person that built that, was of such a nature as an entrepreneur. He started out almost penniless citrus worker in the 1890s. And Sidney Johnson just 2 days ago told me he saw newspaper accounts in the Deland, I think it's in the Deland newspaper, that about 1918 he owned 325 acres of not just citrus but other produce, fruits, vegetables, that kind of thing, which was pretty amazing for somebody in the Jim Crow area. And also what's good, I think, is kind of a model for race relations now. He worked with both black and white business people. When he built this building in the 1920s, they had when we took it apart upstairs, and a lot of it was damaged and termite eaten, etc., but there were 14 rooms upstairs. And he had a lot of young business people and young white business people in there. So there was not that kind of racial divide, and he was kind of into doing business. And the race was kind of a separate issue for him in those days. So he's a really admirable character for us to model after and try to have the right building do the same function 100 years later. So that's what we're excited about. At this point, there are planned to have 8 small offices and a conference room upstairs. And then downstairs, there are 3 showrooms, which we're restoring to look pretty much like they looked in the 1920s, as it just very similar to the downtown commercial buildings that you can see along Woodland Boulevard. This building, when it's fixed up and painted, will look as good or better than most of them downtown. It had tin ceilings in all 3 rooms that covered the whole area. It had really nice trim and woodwork. It had 8/1 double hung windows upstairs. We've just now finishing restoring half of those already, the part that faces out. It's going to be community meeting rooms and a history museum, and we're going to make it work for the community. So we're pretty excited about the potential for what that building could do. Stetson University has gotten involved with us with some issues and helping us out, and also some of the professors with their classes are using the Wright building and other people on that street. And a lot of church groups in that area have outreach for Stetson students to volunteer in the community, doing health related and nutrition related and volunteer work, that kind of stuff. So it's pretty exciting because it does represent real opportunities for improvement for the whole community, you know.
I'll just comment, I've been going through doing the newspaper inventory here, and some of the papers from 1915 to 18, whatever, there's some ads in there for the Wright Insurance Agency. And I know that that was one of the businesses he ran out of that business, was selling insurance.
Wow. I'd love to see those ads. Well, I love old ads like that. Somebody showed me an ad from 1973 for the bank building in Lake Helen. And it was just great to see that because they had a little pen and ink kind of drawing of the front of the columns and everything in there. And it was just kind of exciting to have that kind of ad. And you can learn a lot from advertising in a newspaper, particularly when it's that old, you know. Yeah. Interesting, huh?
I think my comment is, kind of just in the happenstance of how you ended up settling into Deland with Florida Victorian and finding your original storefront, but getting the assistance from Main Street Deland and that help for a young entrepreneur. So do you feel like Main Street Deland is still able and is helping other young entrepreneurs today?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Because first of all, they're helping with marketing, and there's lots of when somebody belongs to the Main Street Association, which I recommend any merchant downtown would be smart to do. You get the advantage of advertising as a group, and you can get in on advertising for certain festivals. And of course, the Beacon newspaper has been really good in supporting the downtown. They put out that map every year for the art festival, for instance, and it's a lot of opportunity for out-of-town people to know what's going on downtown. Yeah, it's really important for entrepreneurs. Usually they don't have a lot of resources. They're young. Maybe some of them are inexperienced. any kind of assistance that someone could give them. It calms them down. You know, I have a huge respect for entrepreneurs because not everybody has the kind of guts it takes to start a business. It's a real gamble, and a lot of businesses fail despite how hard you work. And so it is a gamble, but there's a certain freedom there that's just incredible. You can work as many hours a week as you want, and but it can be tremendously rewarding. So, and again, I can't say enough about the Main Street in Deland. Now, there's also a good Main Street program in Sanford. This city manager in Crescent City, they're trying to see if they can get a Main Street program going. It's really a creative way to put merchants together with banks and insurance people and get the Chamber of Commerce involved. And it's a certain kind of mix that seems to work in a lot of communities. Dunedin over near Clearwater had a Main Street program and still does. That's done wonderful things. You know, it really is the best way that I know of. Now, certainly Merchants Association can get together and do things, but they usually have a narrower focus than some of the places. So, one other thing you mentioned, the people that asked about in DeLeon Springs, I think anyone that's interested in historic preservation, there's all kinds of ways to get involved. I mean, the County Preservation Board meets once a month at least. Lake Helen Preservation Board meets once a month. The one in Deland, you can learn a lot. For instance, in Lake Helen, our Preservation Board not only handles our small 66-house historic district, but we're also in charge of overseeing the woods of Lake Helen and other developments right near the historic district that when they had the original development order prescribed that they would have to build traditional houses. And so we're kind of the board that these builders have to come to. And frankly, I'm really proud of what we've done.
It looks really good there.
There's 103 lots in that area, and I think they're built out now to 80 some odd lots are all with houses on them. And it's beautiful what's happened. There's a real variety in there, a variety of color, a variety of historic styles. And it's been a real education for me to learn about new building materials. Sometimes traditional housing, there's a certain list of things that go in an old historic house, but in a brand new house you have synthetics and polyurethanes and all kinds of stuff. And environmentally, some things are better than some of the old stuff, maybe, in terms of surviving, like porch flooring and hardy board and some of these other things that builders use now. So it's been good to mix it up a little bit and learn some new techniques that get involved in housing. So, but again, I've already said that Historic Museum is a good place to start to get involved because there's all sorts of possibilities here for historic tours and other events as a volunteer participant. So,
All right.
So with that,
Well, thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for viewing at home. And we hope to welcome everybody back in person soon for another local history talk.
great. Thank you.